Daniel chapter 8. We kind of discussed last week about Daniel chapter 7 and how many people kind of mentally switch gears into prophecy mode when they get to Daniel chapter 7. And yet, we look back at this chart, which kind of shows, in my opinion, that chapter 7 really kind of belongs with the first half of the book, if you want to call it that, because of the linguistics, because of the theme that rides throughout. You remember every chapter in chapters 2 through 7 has something in common. If you remember what it is, each chapter has a proclamation, or at least the recognition, that the God of Israel, the God of Daniel, the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is the true God. And each chapter contains a bold-faced, huge print proclamation by the emperor or some, the king, that this is the God that we serve. Disregard the gods of Babylon, disregard the gods of the Medes and the Persians. This is the God who calls the shots. Well, you notice that this week we get to Daniel chapter 8, and so we have actually turned the corner.
Okay. I didn't know.
Yeah. Yeah. See, I warned you.
I didn't want to interrupt.
That's fine. It's all right. Come on in. Now, I told you, nobody's looking at the kids, right? Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay. Maybe we can have them give us a preview.
Oh, say you're on this side. Yep. That's okay. You're good. Right there. Just love it.
All right.
Perfect. Gabby, come here.
I might as well not even try. It's not even worth it. Uh-huh.
Mine's a step down.
How's it feel, kids, to be in front? Pretty fun, huh?
Step down one. Okay. You see where you're at? Do you want to wave at everybody?
Everybody wave.
Everybody wave. Okay. Did you see anybody you know? Yep, wave. No. You don't see anybody you know? We know somebody's waving at you from the balcony.
All right.
Thanks. Okay, Quinn.
All right, kiddos, remember where you're standing. You'll be here later, okay?
Yep, this is where you'll be later, okay? Come in.
Okay.
Gabby,
If you're watching this online, this is probably the best part of the lesson, what you just saw. Yeah, it doesn't get any better than that. Thanks, kids. We'll see you later. Where was I? I don't even know. Yeah, start over, right. We're in chapter 8. Refocus. We started on the prophetic section of the book, right? And starting in chapter 8 through the end of the book, we nowhere else see one of those proclamations where God is the greatest God. He is the true one. That doesn't happen again throughout the book. At this point, I think he's turned his attention back to Israel. He's speaking to them in Hebrew. Israel is to already know that their God is the true God. He shouldn't have to tell them that, especially after the first half of the book where he proclaims that to the entire empire. But he's speaking to his own people now, and he shouldn't have to reiterate that he is the one and true God. They should know that by now. And so he really starts to focus in and tell them about things that are to come, specifically that pertain to them. And yet, while he kind of shifts gears, I don't think we are to completely forget the first half of the book. Remember, the first half establishes who God is and his power and his majesty and his sovereignty, and he calls the shots. Remember the recurring theme. He puts people up and he takes people down. And that's really what we see play out through the second half of the book. It's a silly illustration, but I'll tell it really quickly here. I remember back in school when we went to a track meet, and they had a track team that was running the mile relay, right? Every guy runs a quarter mile, and they pass off the baton. And so the team starts, the gun goes off, and they start running around, and we're kind of holding our own against the other schools. And the second guy grabs it, and he runs around. Third guy grabs it, he runs around. By the time the third guy was done, we were a little bit behind. We had a little bit of ground to make up if we had any hope of winning the relay. Everybody knows that you keep your best runner until the last leg of the relay, right? Your anchor runner, because he's the best. And we had a pretty good anchor runner, and so we were all hoping, boy, I don't know if he can make up the distance between us and the winner, but here's hoping. And so the last guy gets the baton, and he just starts running like crazy. And he reaches the first corner, and he's making up some ground, and they curve around the first bend. And by the start of the back stretch, he's almost caught up to the lead guy. He was doing really well. He was flying. And they run along the back stretch, and they're kind of just neck and neck, running along as fast as they can, trying to get around to win the relay race. And they run all the way along the back stretch. And our guy, he's not falling behind, but he's not really getting ahead either. They're just kind of tied all the way around. As the story goes, they got to the beginning of, what do you call it, the curve at the far side. Is there a special name for that? I don't know. The last corner, whatever it is, as you start to go into the big last curve. As the story goes, our guy looks over at the other guy who's competing with him, who's neck and neck, and he looks at him and he says, "Bye-bye." And he takes off and just starts pouring it on and leaves the other guy in the dust. We couldn't believe it, but we finished way out ahead of that other guy, that other competitor. And it's a fun illustration because in the first half of his lap, we thought he was doing really well. He caught up, he closed the gap, and he was doing fine. But in the last half, we realized how fast he could really go. And while we were impressed at the first part, we realized that our impression was a little bit misplaced because we hadn't seen anything yet. It also turns out that saying bye-bye to your competitor halfway through a race is poor sports etiquette because he got a scolding by the coach afterwards for poor sportsmanship. Apparently that's not the thing to do. But the point is that what we thought was good speed before, when we realized what good speed was afterwards, then we realized what to be impressed with. And that's kind of how I see this book. God has established himself as the sovereign God before because he saved Daniel out of the lion's den. And he saved Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego out of a fiery furnace. And God interprets a dream. And those are all impressive things. But when you get to the second half of the book and see how God really lets it go, and he is controlling empire after empire, and he's calling the shots almost like a puppet master. Here's what's going to happen here. Here's what's going to happen there. I'm in control of this. I'm in control of that. Centuries and even millennia ahead of time, and he's calling the shots clear out ahead of time. All of a sudden, a little lion's den or a little fiery furnace almost doesn't seem as impressive anymore when you see God pull back and start organizing on a global, grand, universal scale everything that will happen in large, grand scale. And that's when we can really be impressed. And so we take what we learned in the first half of the book, super apply it to the second half, because God has now gained credibility as the sovereign God of the universe. And then we see him really start to call the shots on a big national and international scale. So don't forget the first half of the book is what I'm saying as we get into the second half. If you have your Bibles, we're going to start reading in chapter 8, verses 1 and 2. Daniel chapter 8, verses 1 and 2. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at the first, which would have been chapter 7. And I saw in the vision, and when I saw, I was in Susa, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision, and I was at the Ulai Canal. There's a bunch of different locations going on there. Here's a picture up on the screen of the Persian Empire that was to come, right? Daniel, he says he's still working for Belshazzar. He was the last king of Babylon before they were overthrown. So this is before the Medes and the Persians ever came in and overthrew Babylon. So Daniel, I'm sure, was here in Babylon serving the king. In fact, at the end of the chapter, he says, after the vision, I got up and went about the king's business. So he was probably in Babylon at the time. But in his vision, when God gives him the vision, he is where? He is down here in Susa. Now, in the Babylonian kingdom, that was kind of out on the outer skirts of the edge of the empire. Of course, in the Medo-Persian Empire, it covers a much larger area, and so it's kind of in the middle there. Why in the world would Daniel's vision have taken place in Susa if he is located in Babylon? Well, it's interesting to note again, as you can see on the screen, Susa was what would become the capital of the Medo-Persian Empire, the empire that was to come. So he's receiving this vision not in the current empire, but in the next one. And as he talks about, his vision really doesn't concern Babylon, right? It concerns the Medo-Persians and then the kingdom that is to come after that, which was the Greeks. And so the Babylonian Empire in his vision is kind of past already. And so he sees his vision from the capital of the Medo-Persian Empire. His vision also doesn't take place in the Greek Empire, because as you read through history, none of the battles between Greece and the Medes and the Persians ever takes place in Greece, right? Greece is the instigator, right? They're the opponent, and they come and take the fight to the Medo-Persians. And so fighting doesn't take place on Greek soil, it takes place on the Medo-Persian Empire soil. And so that's where he sees this vision. By the way, you'll know Susa, where he receives this vision, the capital of the Medes and the Persians, is also where you'll recognize this elsewhere in the Bible. It's where Esther takes place, the book of Esther, because that's in the capital of the Medo-Persian Empire. Also, it's where Nehemiah starts out serving as the cupbearer before he's sent back to Jerusalem. And so that helps tie things together a little bit. Let's continue reading here in verse 3. I raised my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had 2 horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. And as I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. And he came to the ram with the 2 horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him in his powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him, and struck the ram, and broke his 2 horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him. And there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. Then the goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it there came up 4 conspicuous horns towards the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great towards the south, towards the east, and towards the glorious land. It grew great, even to the host of heaven. And some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. It became great, even as great as the prince of the host, and the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. And a host will be given over to it, together with the regular burnt offering, because of transgression. And it will throw truth to the ground, and will act and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot? And he said to me, For 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it. And behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, and it called, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. So he came near where I stood. And when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, Understand, O Son of Man, that the vision is for the time of the end. And when he had spoken to me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face to the ground. But he touched me and made me stand up. And he said, Behold, I will make known to you what shall be at the latter end of the indignation, for it refers to the appointed time of the end. And from here on, he starts interpreting the vision. So we read the vision in the first half of the chapter here. Verses 20 through the end of the book. He interprets what was seen. So we're going to kind of backtrack, read the vision again, and read the interpretation, get an idea of what's going on here. Verses 3 and 4 say, as we recall, I raised my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had 2 horns. Both horns were high, but one was higher than the other. And the higher one came up last. I saw the ram charging westward, northward, and southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. Again, verse 20 tells us, As for the ram that you saw with the 2 horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. So there's the ram. It's got 2 horns. One horn grows up first. Another horn grows up a little bit later, but the second one gets even greater and taller and stronger than the first horn did. Again, it tells us exactly what this is referring to. That's the Medo-Persian Empire. I think I mentioned before, but in this empire, the Medians started out stronger. They kind of were the power first. Then Persia overtook them, and over time, Persia became greater then, and Media became lesser. And so those are the 2 horns. The one comes up later, Persia, but eventually it becomes the stronger half of the two, and they're the ones that rule. And it says he charges north. Where is it? I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. No beast could stand before him. So you can see in the map there, starting from Susa, which I've circled in green, westward is off towards Greece and Egypt, that side of it. That would be the left side of your screen. It talks about him going northward up towards Greece there, and then south down towards Egypt. You'll also notice it doesn't mention east. There is a lot of land off to the east, but again, from what I can tell, there's not a whole lot of interesting stuff going on out there, kind of back wilderness, so it's not as critical or as interesting to the empire. But he goes west and north and south, and he conquers all that area there, all of that civilization that the Babylonians held before, and then some. And so that's how that interprets and plays out. Then, in verses 21 and 22, says, the goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn between his eyes is the first king. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others rose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. Again, he talks about that in verses 5 through 8. He says, as I was considering, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. Think back from last week. Why would the goat not even touch the ground? How did we describe the Grecian Empire last week? Yeah, really, really fast, right? As if the goat is going so fast he doesn't even touch the ground, almost like he's flying really fast. Do you remember how chapter 7 described the Grecian Empire? It says it's like a leopard, which is fast, and the leopard even had what? Wings on his back, flying super fast. And again, that's consistent with this chapter. Without touching the ground, and the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. Remember what happened in Greece? They had one prominent leader that made it great. His name was Alexander the Great, right? And he became great. He conquered everything really fast. He conquered the entire Medo-Persian Empire, essentially, plus or minus a little here and there. But he did so very, very fast. And then we see verse, where am I? Verse 6. He came to the ram with 2 horns. So Greece approaches the Medo-Persians, which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him with his powerful wrath, as fast and as hard as he could. He just attacks the Medes and the Persians, and that's what Alexander did. Verse 7, I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him, struck the ram, broke his 2 horns. Again, the horns talks about the power of the nations, and so he destroyed their power, he wiped them out, he rendered them ineffective, and the ram had no power to stand before him. But he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him. There was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. Verse 8, then the goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken. Again, you remember last week we talked about this a little bit. As soon as Alexander had gotten done capturing the empire and conquering everything he wanted to conquer, suddenly he kind of unexpectedly died at a very young age, right? Got sick, or some say he was poisoned, we don't know. But the point is he died kind of at the prime of his reign. And instead of it, the one horn, there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. Again, Alexander, I'm sure, was not expecting to die at age 32. He did not have an heir to take over the kingdom. He didn't really appoint a single leader to take over his empire after he was gone, and so his generals kind of divided up the kingdom. And here's how it went. There's 4 of them. One was named, boy, I'm going to mess this up, Lysimachus. He got Thrace and Asia Minor. There was Cassander. He took Macedonia and Greece. Seleucus took Syria and the east, and Ptolemy took Egypt. Aren't you glad you know all those names now? Don't you feel better? Everybody good now? Okay, we can go home. Those 4 generals who helped him conquer all these lands and these regions now stop being the generals, and they become kings of their own little regions of the empire. And so the empire kind of still loosely exists, but it wasn't unified like it used to be. It didn't have the strength and direction that it used to have. It didn't have the ferociousness that it had under Alexander. It's just kind of almost, if you can call it, a United States of Greece, kind of, except for the states weren't even united. Each had its own leader. There was a lot of infighting between them for territory. They spent all their efforts fighting against each other, not really expanding or not really bettering the kingdom. In fact, I put a map up here. I know this isn't visually the highest quality map you could find, but it was about the best descriptive-wise. You can see the 4 different colors there. The blue is Macedonia. That's the one that Cassander, the general Cassander, ruled. You see the green there is Thrace. That was the one that Lysimachus, I hope I'm getting that right, he ruled. Then the orange, over towards the east there, was the Seleucids, and the Ptolemies was pink down towards Egypt. Now, over time, the orange section and the pink section kind of became the dominant 2 sections, and they would fight a lot back and forth. And in fact, the orange, later on, the Seleucids really went down and attacked and took over the pink. But you notice kind of what is in the middle there. There's where you see the orange come up, and the pink kind of has an arm that comes up along the sea there. You see kind of what's in the center of that little strip in between the two, right in the middle? There's an outhouse, no, there might have been. An outpost town called what? Jerusalem. Yeah, where the Jewish people would have been centered. And so when the orange attacks the pink, who's right in the middle? Jerusalem kind of gets overrun. And when the pink attacks back to the orange, who gets caught in the middle? Jerusalem. So no matter which side wins, Jerusalem kind of loses because they're always on the battlefront. And back and forth, they get wiped over and wiped over and wiped over. And it's kind of a foreshadowing of the difficult times that are to come. Now, at this point in the chapter, we've talked about the 2 kingdoms that were, well, we didn't talk about Babylon. There's Babylon, then the Medes and the Persians, and then the Greeks. And that's kind of the big picture context of what's going on. But from here on, he kind of narrows his focus, Daniel does, down to what you could almost call a small detail, except for it's not a small detail at all. He starts looking at one little horn that grows out of one of the others. Pick it up in verse 9. He says, out of one of them, that is the 4 horns that grew up later, came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great towards the south. Now, that doesn't mean in the south, it says towards the south, okay? In other words, it expands towards the south. We just looked at the south. I told you about this. Towards the east and towards the glorious land. Again, maybe I should have backed here. I think I can back up, can I? No. Okay, good. The map is still there. Good. So it expands towards the south. That's down towards Egypt. Towards the east, off in that direction, and towards the glorious land, which we already talked about, would be Jerusalem, Israel, which is caught right in the middle. So he expands and he tries to make aggressive moves in that direction. Verse 10, it grew great even to the host of heaven. And some of the host, which we believe to be the Jewish people, God's host of people, and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. So he's really, the Jewish people and the people living in Jerusalem are getting the short end of the stick. They're getting beat down by this army, by this horn. Verse 11, it became great, the horn did, even as great as the prince of the host, and the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown as a result of this aggression and this horn's attacks on not just Egypt, but Jerusalem along the way. A lot of people were taken down. A lot of people were killed. It says the regular burnt offering was taken away. It was undone. It was canceled. And the place of the sanctuary was overthrown. The place of the sanctuary in Jerusalem obviously would have been the temple area, right? Verse 12, and a host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression. A host given over to it. God's people will be subject to him and mistreated in a very bad way. And the regular burnt offering because of transgression, because of their sins. And it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over the sanctuary to be and host to be trampled underfoot? In other words, how long will Jerusalem be oppressed by this little horn and be just ravaged and destroyed? How long is that going to happen? Verse 14, he said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. Now look at some of the characteristics of this little horn that Daniel focuses in on as he reads through. In verse 9, he says, this little horn comes up from what empire? From what race? It's from the Greek people, right? Because out of one of the four horns of Greece. So whoever this guy is, whatever's going on here, it happens from the Greek Empire. It says he's great towards the south and towards the east. Whoever this is going to be aggressive in those directions, towards the east and then down towards the south. Again, remember the map, down through Jerusalem and down towards Egypt. It says he takes away offerings in the temple in Jerusalem. And finally, he makes the transgression that makes desolate. Some people might say the abomination that causes what? Desolation. Yeah. So there's some characteristics of this horn. The question is what are we talking about here, or who are we talking about? I want to read for you a little bit longer passage here. This is actually out of the book of Maccabees. Has anyone heard of the book of Maccabees? Maccabees is what we would call an apocryphal book. It was written during the intertestamental time, actually about the time that all of this played out. Without taking up too much time, the Maccabees fought against this guy, but they wrote a book. Again, we don't consider it to be inspired, but it's still super great history, still super informative, and I want you to listen to the description written at that time of what was going on around this time period. First Maccabees chapter 1. After Alexander the Macedonian, Philip's son, who came from the land of Kittim, had defeated Darius, you know Darius, you remember him, Medes and Persians, the Greek took over the Persians, the king of the Persians and the Medes, he became king in his place, having first ruled in Greece. He fought many battles, captured fortresses, put the kings of the earth to death. He advanced to the ends of the earth, gathering plunder from many nations. The earth fell silent before him, and his heart became proud and arrogant. He collected a very strong army and won dominion over princes, nations, rulers, and they paid him tribute. But after all this, he took to his bed, realizing that he was going to die. So he summoned his noblest officers, who had been brought up with him from his youth, and divided his kingdom among them while he was still alive. Alexander had reigned for 12 years when he died. Does any of that sound familiar, according to what Daniel prophesied? To the letter, right? To the letter. Remember, Daniel wrote this years and years and years before any of this happened. Continuing on. Verse 8, so his officers took over the kingdom, each in his own territory, and after his death they put on all diadems, crowns, and they took charge and authority, and so did their sons after them for many years, multiplying evils on the earth. There sprang from these a sinful offshoot, Antiochus Epiphanes, son of King Antiochus, once a hostage at Rome. He became king in the 137th year of the kingdom of the Greeks, towards the end of their reign. In those days there appeared in Israel transgressors of the law, who seduced many, saying, let us go and make a covenant with the Gentiles around us, since we separated from them, and many evils have come upon us. In other words, there was a faction of the Jews that said, let's stop being Jewish, let's get along with everybody, we're tired of fighting, we're tired of being oppressed, let's just basically give up our Jewish ways and the Mosaic law and everything following God. Let's just become Gentiles, right? Which, of course, is a horrible idea. But there was a faction of the Jews that said that. Let's just give it all up, submit to the Gentiles, become one of them. Maybe we'll get along with people better. You remember what the passage we just read said, right? This guy raised up because of transgressions. I think I know what the transgression is now, right? So, verse 12, the proposal was agreeable. They got a bunch of people to go along with it. Some from among the people promptly went to the king, Antiochus Epiphanes, and he authorized them to introduce the ordinance of the Gentiles. He said, yes, this is a good idea. Let's stop you guys from being Jewish. We're going to assimilate you into our Gentile society and do away with all of your Jewish customs, laws, and practices and all that stuff. You will become one of us. Thereupon they built a gymnasium in Jerusalem according to the Gentile custom. That's what they like to do, a Gentile gathering place to kind of help instill their Greek culture. Verse 15, they talking about these Jewish people that wanted to go over to the Greeks, they disguised their circumcision and abandoned the Holy Covenant. They allied themselves with the Gentiles and sold themselves to wrongdoing. I think we can see why God had to punish them again, right? When his kingdom seemed secure, Antiochus undertook to become the king of the land of Egypt and to rule over both kingdoms. We already said the orange attacks the pink. He invaded Egypt with a strong force, with chariots, elephants, and cavalry, with a large fleet, to make war on Ptolemy, the king of Egypt. But Ptolemy was frightened at his presence and fled, and many were wounded and fell dead. He became great towards the east and the south. The fortified cities of the land of Egypt were captured, and Antiochus plundered the land of Egypt. After Antiochus had defeated Egypt, the 143rd year, he returned and went up against Israel and against Jerusalem with a strong force. He insolently entered the sanctuary and took away the golden altar, the lampstand for the light with all its utensils, the offering table, the cups and the bowls, the gold censers and the curtain, the cornices and the golden ornaments on the facade of the temple. He stripped it all off. And he took away the silver and gold and the precious vessels. He also took the hidden treasures that he could find, probably to pay his soldiers for all their efforts. That's probably what he did. So he went back to Jerusalem and plundered Jerusalem and took everything out of the temple, just destroyed it, or robbed it, I should say. Taking all this, he went back to his own country. He shed much blood, and he spoke with great arrogance. Does that sound familiar, especially from last week? We talked about the little horn, again, having arrogance, and we're going to kind of combine those two in a little bit. There was great mourning throughout all Israel, and the rulers and the elders groaned. Young women and men languished, and the beauty of women faded. Every bridegroom took up lamentation, while the bride sitting in her chamber mourned, and the land quaked on account of its inhabitants, and all the house of Jacob was clothed with shame. 2 years later, the king sent the Mysian commander to the cities of Judah, and he came to Jerusalem with a strong force. He spoke deceitfully in peaceful terms, and they believed him. Then he attacked the city suddenly in a great onslaught and destroyed many of the people in Israel. He plundered the city and set fire to it, demolished its houses and its surrounding walls. Came deceitfully, right? Governed by deceit. Spoke peaceful terms, broke the covenant, and then turned around and attacked and destroyed them. They took captive the women and children, seized the animals. Then they built up the city of David with high, strong walls and strong towers, and it became their citadel. In other words, they set up base there. They installed a sinful race, transgressors of the law, who fortified themselves inside it. They stored up weapons and provisions, depositing the plunder there they had collected from Jerusalem, and they became a great snare. The citadel became an ambush against the sanctuary, and a wicked adversary to Israel at all times. They shed innocent blood around the sanctuary. They defiled the sanctuary. Because of them, the inhabitants of Jerusalem fled away. They became an abode of strangers. She became a stranger to her own offspring, and her children forsook her. Everybody's just fleeing out of Jerusalem because conditions are so bad. Her sanctuary became desolate as a wilderness. Her feasts were turned into mourning, her Sabbaths to shame, her honor to contempt. As her glory had been, so great was her dishonor. Her exaltation was turning into mourning. Then the king wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people and abandon their particular customs. All the Gentiles conformed to the command of the king. So again, he came to the Jews and said, you are no longer Jewish. Now you're a Gentile. You're going to give up all your Jewish ways, all the observances of the law, all your feasts, everything, and you're going to become a Gentile. You can imagine how well that went over with some people. But there was already another faction that said, yes, we're in favor of this. Remember that. Many Israelites delighted in his religion. They sacrificed to idols and profaned the Sabbath. Hey, this is no problem. In fact, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but this is the mindset, at least, if not the exact group that later became what we would call in the New Testament the Sadducees, I believe, right? They didn't believe in the afterlife. They wanted to conform and work with the Gentile people. They kind of gave up all of that religious stuff that the Jews had held to. I could be wrong on that, but at least that's the same philosophy, because I know the Sadducees were more Greek-minded, and they didn't believe in the spirit world. The king sent letters by messengers to Jerusalem, to the city of Judah, ordering them to follow customs of their foreign to the land, to prohibit burnt offerings, sacrifices, libations in the sanctuary, to profane the Sabbaths and the feasts, to desecrate the sanctuary and the sacred ministers, to build pagan altars and temples and shrines, to sacrifice swine and unclean animals, to leave their sons uncircumcised, and to defile themselves with every kind of impurity and abomination, so that they might forget the law and change all of its ordinances. He forced them to come in and abandon everything that God had commanded them to do, and if they didn't, they were to die. I remember from chapter 7, the little horn. Remember what one of the things he wanted to do was to change the times and the ordinances. Yeah, fascinating. Whoever refused to act according to the king was to be put to death. In words such as these he wrote to the whole kingdom, and he appointed inspectors over the people, and he ordered the cities of Judah to offer sacrifices, each city in turn, not sacrifices to God, but sacrifices to the false gods, the Greek gods. Many of the people, those who abandoned the law, joined them, and they committed evil in the land. They drove Israel into hiding wherever places of refuge could be found, that is, those that didn't want to abandon the law. On the 15th day of the month of Kislev, in the year 145, the king erected the desolating abomination upon the altar of burnt offerings, and in the surrounding cities of Judah they built pagan altars. They burned incense at the doors of the houses and the streets. Any scrolls of the law, Moses' law, the books of the Bible, that they found, they tore up and burned. Whoever was found with a scroll of the covenant, or whoever observed the law, was condemned to death by royal decree. So they used their power against Israel, against those who were caught, each month in the cities. On the 25th day of the month, they sacrificed on the pagan altar that was over the altar of the burnt offerings. In keeping with the decree, they put to death women who had their children circumcised, which is a command of God. And they hung their babies from around their necks. So they'd kill the infants and force the mothers to carry the dead babies around their necks. Their families also, and those who had circumcised them, were killed. But many in Israel were determined and resolved in their hearts not to eat anything unclean, and they preferred to die rather than to be defiled with food or profane the holy covenant. And they did die. And very great wrath came upon Israel. This is what you call a live account of the prophecies which Daniel talked about. This little horn that does horrible things, desecrations, setting up abominations that cause desolation, building a false god altar right on top of the altar of the God of Israel in his own temple, setting up idols, forcing people to abandon God's law over and over and over. I say all that to ask again the question, who is chapter 8, verses 9 through 14 talking about? I think it's pretty clear, in my opinion, he's talking clearly about this guy, Antiochus Epiphanes. But that's not the end of the chapter. He continues on, if you can fast forward to verse 23. We got to hurry through this a little bit, but I think you'll get the point. Verse 23, at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power. And he shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall become great. Does that fit Antiochus? Yeah, it does. He shall even rise up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken, but by no human hand. The visions of the evenings and mornings that has been told is true, but seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. Now look forward to verses 23 and 26, which we just read, and compare that to the first part. What characterizes the little horn in this passage? He gives further description. He says, when the transgressors have reached their limit, when we're done with sin, when we're done with the bad guys, when their time is up and their time is over. Did that happen in Antiochus' time? Has more sin been committed since his time? Yeah, there has, so I'm not sure how well that fits. He will become to ruin not by his own power. He'll come to power, but not by his own power. What about he will rise up against the prince of the princes? Who's that talking? Who's the prince of princes? There's only one person I can think about like that. And Antiochus, he fought against God, but I don't know. Broken by no human hand in verse 25. That almost sounds familiar. Almost sounds a lot like what? Chapters 2 and chapter 7, right? Are we still talking about Antiochus Epiphanes? There's similarities, right? They do similar things, but in this last passage here, I almost think he's kind of almost morphed into talking even somebody more evil than Antiochus. Remember throughout the Old Testament, oftentimes, or sometimes I should say, when it talks about messianic prophecies, the coming Messiah, and David will write about him in the Psalms, or another prophet will foretell about the Messiah, they often start talking about somebody else of current contemporary time, but it almost kind of fades into talking about somebody greater, right? David will write a psalm about what he's going through, but every now and then he'll slip in something that makes you think, wow, this is talking about somebody more than David, greater than David. And it kind of morphs into talking about the Messiah himself. And I think that's kind of what this chapter does here. He starts off talking about Antiochus Epiphanes. But by the end of the chapter, we've almost changed into somebody even worse, if you can call it greater in evil than Antiochus, right? I think he's talking here about the future Antichrist, because he becomes great not by his own power. Evil forces, Satan is driving him, rises up against the Prince of Princes directly. The Antichrist in the last day fights against Jesus one-on-one. Broken, but by no human hands. The Antichrist is taken down, but not because of people. It's because he's fighting the Prince of Princes himself. And so I think Antiochus in this chapter, while the first part I think is clearly talking about him, the last part I think is morphed into talking about the Antichrist himself. And he's warning Israel of days to come, not just in the 2nd century BC, but also what we would consider future to us today as a warning of the bad times to come. I want to close with this. Having established his greatness, power, and sovereignty in chapters 2 through 7, God uses that credibility to declare his future plans to Israel. Specifically, he warns them of hard times to come, both in the coming centuries and of the time of the end. So we're to recognize and remember his sovereign power even when it appears that evil is winning in an overwhelming way. And again, I told you not to forget chapters 2 through 7, how God is sovereign. And yet then he turns his attention to talk about the evil times to come. And we have to remember that, yes, he's calling the shots. God knows what's going to happen. He's foretelling it already. And yet the bad guys are going to have their day. So don't forget that God is in charge, and in the end he will win. Sorry, we got to wrap it up. I'd love to play on this a little bit more, but we got to close. Let's pray. Dear God, we thank you for this morning. We can take a look at what you have in store for the world, some very scary times. We know that ultimately you will win, but that doesn't mean it will be a smooth ride to the finish. It will be a rough ride, and evil will win or appear to be winning for quite a while. Things will get very bad, and yet you promise to preserve your people, Israel. You promise to protect the church, and you say that you will win in the end. Help us to remain faithful to you regardless of the circumstances. In Jesus' name I pray, amen.